Let us talk a bit about the ancient Library of Alexandria. 2,300 years ago, the ancient Library of Alexandria was a revolutionary effort to organize global knowledge and create the first universal libraries. Now remember, there were older libraries available in Greece, available in Egypt, but this was the first effort where Greek libraries looked to Greek knowledge, Egyptian libraries looked to Egyptian knowledge. This was the first effort to bring together universal knowledge in a single library. It was feasible because Alexander, a young man, had actually conquered the world and brought it under his domain. And of course, he was the pupil of Aristotle and therefore was also concerned about spreading the Hellenistic culture. He was not just one of the greatest conquerors of all time, but he actually created that huge empire all the way to the Himalayas, where he is said to have wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. But amazing as it may seem, having done all that on foot for most of his soldiers, he died very young, and his empire then was divided among his generals. And in Egypt, it was Ptolemy I who would rule the Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt, because Alexander came, identified the site of Alexandria, then moved on to the oracle in Siwa, and then the oracle told him what he wanted to hear, basically that he was divine and not just a mortal. And he left and never came back. So it was left to Ptolemy to build the great new city of Alexandria. And Demetrius of Phaleron, who had been tyrant of Athens and was no longer in governance in Athens, advised Ptolemy and told him, in fact, if you want Alexandria to be the greatest city in the world, temples, marbles, and gold are fine, but bring the greatest minds in the world to Alexandria and then give them nothing to do. Now that was kind of an unusual perspective at the time. This revolutionary idea is quite contemporary. The Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, for example, would say, Mr. Einstein, come to the Institute, and if you want to teach, you can teach. If you want to do research, you can do research. If you want to write, you can write, whatever you want to do. The main thing is just to be here. So they said, fine, but what shall we call this institution? And they decided to call it a temple to the muses. The museum in Latin, museon in Greek, but without the connotation of a modern museum. And they created that institution with residential areas and a temple, and they added a botanical garden, a zoological garden, a dissection room, and a library. And the library grew and grew and grew, and so they built a second building of the library next to the harbor, and then a third daughter library was attached to the temple to Serapis in the other side of town. And soon the world knew the great city of Alexandria, most important city in the Hellenistic world, had two marvelous institutions. One, a library with no parallel anywhere in the world, and one, the Pharos, or the great lighthouse of the great city of Alexandria. This is a reconstruction as imagined by Carl Sagan in Cosmos of what the ancient library looked like. We don't know for sure, but we know that it was an institution that was part academy, part educational institution, part research. And we had girl students already active 200 BC in the ancient library. There were scrolls and scrolls and scrolls. There was a scriptorium to copy things and a way of actually translating a lot of these. It was an explosion of knowledge unseen before or since. In fact, it is in the ancient library that Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century BC was the first human being to say that the earth revolves around the sun. We don't have his writings, but we have writings of people who said, I disagree with the crazy theory of Aristarchus that the earth revolves around the sun. And the third director, my great hero, Eratosthenes, who straddles the 2nd and 3rd centuries, he brought Archimedes to the library, and he tasked the great Callimachus to do something. He was father of geography, grammarian, and many things. He was very precise. He actually measured the tilt of the Earth's axis exactly correctly as we do know it today for almost 23 degrees, 51 minutes and 15 seconds. And he also calculated the circumference of the Earth with an accuracy of 98.5%. How did he do that? He posited that the sun is so far away that the rays of the sun come in parallel. And he knew that in a place called Sien, which is today's Aswan, on the solstice, the stick that is put in the ground has no shadow. If you look in a deep well, there is no shadow. So he said that must be vertical in relation to the Earth. But at the same time, we know that in Alexandria, there is a shadow at that time. And so he said, well, we can estimate the angle in Alexandria, which by elementary geometry has to be equal to the angle between the two sticks in Aswan and in Alexandria. And we can calculate the distance between Alexandria and Aswan. And then that angle, which is 7.12 degrees, in relation to 360 degrees is equivalent to that distance to the circumference of the Earth. And it was remarkably accurate. And what is really amazing is the elegance of the way he thought about it. And he wasn't the only one. Hipparchus calculated the length of the solar year, the 365 days in the quarter, to within 6.5 minutes. And compiled the first known star catalog and made an early formulation for trigonometry. And if you think the instruments that they didn't have in the time, these are remarkable scientific achievements. And it's great that they were written down and copied and recopied and finally reached us to this day. And who came and fell madly in love with Cleopatra, of course, was Julius Caesar. And he was so impressed with the calendar of 365 days in the quarter and then adding one day every 4 years that he adopted it and forced it onto the whole Roman Empire, and it became the basis of the Julian calendar for the Roman Empire. But without question, the most successful of all the professors that were at the ancient library was Euclid, whose elements of geometry are also the foundations of axiomatic mathematics and law and logic. He is mostly known through the commentaries of others, specifically Theon of Alexandria, who wrote about it, but it remains one of the most published texts after the invention of printing, and it is still used for the basis of most of the elementary geometry that kids learn in school. So Euclid's Elements is one of the great works, and these are marginalia in various books. This one is published in 1482. Archimedes the Great actually came and stayed in Alexandria for 2.5 years, in which time, of course, he did not jump out of his bath. That was another story known about him. He is the one who jumped out of the bath, having found a way of figuring out the density of a crown, which you see next to him here. And he ran down supposedly saying, "Eureka, Eureka, I have found it, I have found it." But he did say he, given a space to stand on, he could move the earth with a lever. And when he was in Alexandria, he actually did some interesting work to solve real problems, including the development of the Archimedean screw. And as you can see, he wanted to help Egyptians lift water from the Nile for irrigation. And it is still in use today, over 2,000 years later, as you can see. Herophilus the Great was the father of functional physiology. He did detailed postmortems and worked on the circulatory system and other things. And Manetho, the great historian, chronicled the pharaohs, organized the dynasties, and is the author of the Egyptiaga. And he actually designed the dynasties. So when we say such and such a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty or the 13th dynasty, we are using the classifications that Manetho did at the time of the ancient library. And as for the Septuagint, it was the first time that the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek was at the Library of Alexandria. Now, Eratosthenes looked to Callimachus, arguably one of the greatest poets of the Hellenistic period, and told him, do something useful. Instead of just writing poetry, write a catalogue for the library. And Callimachus did. And he wrote the Pinakes, a 120-volume catalogue. That was the first time that universal knowledge was organized by subject and organized by author within subject, and authors ranked alphabetically by their name, which is the way we still do it to this day. Thanks to the Pinakes, which was copied and recopied many times, we also know how much we have lost of our great cultural heritage. So, for example, we know that Euripides wrote 95 plays and only 18 have survived. Aeschylus wrote 70 to 90 plays, of which only 7 survived. And Sophocles wrote over 120 plays, of which only 7 have survived. It is, of course, tragic to know that we have lost all of that in the successive fires that destroyed the ancient library, but it is good that the Pinakes was copied and recopied, so at least we know what existed once before. And it was copied in something called the Suda, which was an encyclopedic document that was available in the Renaissance. So the ancient library would disappear through a series of fires and series of destruction over a long period of several centuries. And so very little remains physically, but it lives in the mind of all people, for it brought together all the intellects of all the societies of the then known world, and brought together poets and mathematicians and astronomers and geographers and grammarians, and it produced an incredible fireworks of intellectual achievement. Now, we reconstruct all that history from the published record. Fragile as the original scrolls were, they were copied and recopied, and we can thus confirm many parts of that ancient history. And we also have monuments, artifacts that are witnesses of that past glory and its legacies in the texts. For example, we know that girls studied at the ancient library, and we have this beautiful Tanagra statue of a girl student writing in the Library of Alexandria about 200 BC. And when I was the librarian of Alexandria, and I had classes of little girls coming to visit, and they would look at the statue and ask me, is that an iPad that she has on her lap? And I say, no, not really. It was a slate on which they used to write with chalk, but it's interesting to see that they can relate to it. Now, after the great story of Antony and Cleopatra and their defeat at the hands of the future Augustus, the Roman Empire became the major power in the whole world, leaving aside China and beyond the Himalayas. And that would continue, and Egypt would continue to be part of the Roman Empire. It became a province. And the emergence of Christianity came in 50 AD at the hand of Saint Mark, who came to preach in Alexandria, but it led to a horrible persecution of the Christians in Egypt by the Romans. And there were riots and fires and civil strife in the late 2nd, early 3rd century. In fact, so terrible was the persecution of the Christians in Egypt by the Romans that the Coptic calendar, also called the Alexandrian calendar, as used by the Coptic Orthodox Church, and it is 284 is the start of that calendar. It is known as the year of the martyrs. And so terrible was the persecution. So that 2020 AD would be equal to 1736 on the basis of the year of the martyrs. The Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria continues to this day, one of the oldest churches, and we have also oldest monastic orders in Alexandria. Now, Constantine the Great converted to Christianity, and of course, the capital to Constantinople. He stopped the persecution of the Christians, but he did not ban other religions. And it was only Theodosius I, 70 years later almost, who issued a decree banning all other religions. And as a result, the remaining part of the ancient library, which was in the temple to Serapis on the other side of town, was destroyed by Bishop Theophilus, as can be seen again in a published manuscript. This is a manuscript of 391 AD, which shows Bishop Theophilus destroying the Serapeum. Now, the story of the Serapeum and its destruction led to the last remaining scholars of Alexandria, Theon of Alexandria, who wrote the commentaries on Euclid's Elements, which are the most famous edition of the ancient work of Euclid, and his daughter, the beautiful Hypatia, who is the first woman whose name appears in the records of astronomy and mathematics. And this is in a movie called Agora, where Rachel Weisz plays the role of Hypatia. She was a philosopher and possibly the last recorded scholar. She was killed by a zealot mob in 415 in one of drastic stories of horrible mutilation and so on, and cut to pieces and scraped the flesh from the bones and lit fire to her remains. But it really marks a full stop to the idea of the great scholarship of the ancient Library of Alexandria. And what continued afterwards were schools of philosophy, but that were very much under the thumb of the emerging church, which should not surprise us, because that was also the beginning of the Dark Ages in Europe. But the scientists have recognized the great Hypatia and have named a crater on the moon by her name in her honor. So the original library, the library by the harbor, and the library in the Serapeum, these were the locations of the ancient library, all of which were destroyed over a period of several centuries. And in all of that, it was a magnificent achievement of intellect that brought together the best of the knowledge of the Greeks, the best of the knowledge of the Egyptians, the best of the knowledge of the East, and merged all of that into universal knowledge. And in fact, it gave us a huge expansion in many, many fields. We mentioned geometry, we mentioned mathematics, but we can also look at the origins